Right on the dot. Welcome to PopCon 2020, week two. And we're very excited to be entering our second week and to be launching today, actually, with one of the innovations of our virtual PopCon, and that is live discussions of asynchronous streams, AKA pre-recorded videos. And so today we're starting off with a couple of those asynchronous streams. Before I introduce those panels, I do want to give thanks, where thanks is due, much thanks is due, to our hosts at Mopop, especially Robert Rutherford and Jason Porter, who've been coordinating this with us every step of the way. This year's Pop Conference is supported by Critical Minded, an initiative to invest in cultural critics of color, co-founded by the Nathan Cummings Foundation and the Ford Foundation. And we really appreciate Critical Minded founder Elizabeth Mendez-Berry's support. We also want to thank NPR Music for co-sponsoring our stellar keynotes this year. And I have to thank and shout out each and every member of the 2020 Programming Committee, Hanif Abdurraqib, Raquel Gutierrez, Garrett Kennedy, Summer Kim Lee, Yvonne Ramos, Robert Rutherford, JD Sampson, RJ Smith, Oliver Wong, and our keynote producer, Jason King. And we have a very exciting announcement about a closing keynote for next week from Jason coming tomorrow. So I know that we're supposed to start the first panel of the day is scheduled to have their discussion start at 9:10, but because we kept these introductions short, I like the idea of sprawling out and giving as much time to conversation and discussion as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first panel of the day. And our first, what a great way to start the morning, to feel good as hell. Feeling good as hell, the intergenerational appeal of Lizzo's Exuberance kicks us off today. And the papers and the video presentations included 100% That Bitch, Women Empowerment and Body Positivity on Lizzo's Cause I Love You by Liselotte Podda, Lizzo's Shine and Brown Jouissance by Amber Jamilla Musser, If My Music Is Going to Have a Message, Lizzo the Teacher, Thalken, and Working My Femininity, Instrumentalizing Lizzo as the Voice of Popular Feminism by Alyxandra Vesey. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the panelists. I'm not sure if Liselotte is able to join us from Utrecht today. She might not be, but we have the other three panelists here. And the first thing I'm going to do is throw to the panelists and ask if anyone is interested in asking another panelist a question. Otherwise, I can kick us off with a question.
I say go for it, Karen.
Okay, go for it. Okay, so sure, I'll start off with a question. So it struck me actually, Alex, it's related to one of the driving theses of your presentation, and that is that, you know, what we have come to see as Lizzo's sonic ubiquity, right? And largely as a result of this licensing, like you know, the kind of multi-pronged forms of music licensing that have created this sense of her ubiquity, but also to a certain extent her, I guess, appropriation in popular feminism and framing as a feel-good figure for white women, especially through those marketing lenses. And I wanted to put that into conversation with what Amber was doing specifically in her talk about, you know, brown jouissance and the something special, that shine, that link to that kind of 80s aesthetic of Juice that maybe, I don't know, frustrates, is a part of the forms of cathexis that you're talking about, and how what Amber's talking about is really particular to brown POC Black listeners, whereas what you're documenting is, you know, about the movement of that, or the kind of adoption of that through these commercial means. So I'll just set that up real quick right there, and then we'll, you know, see where things go from there.
Yeah, I was, when I was watching Amber's presentation, I was really sort of struck by, oh, I wish this was actually how Lizzo was licensed. Because when I was thinking about Juice and all the different permutations of how that song has proliferated through licensing, it has largely been meant to frame like sort of multicultural or white female friendships. And I think that has a lot to do largely with who gets to make television and who gets to tell stories in commercial television and film writ large. But thinking about how Amber talks so profoundly about like sort of the brown erotics of Juice, that kind of gets taken out of how that song is framed in commercial storytelling, largely to sort of tell kind of like you go girl narratives among groups of female friends. And actually, one thing that I was sort of noticing, because I've been trying to sort of outline the lineage of how these songs have proliferated through licensing. I recently saw the sneak preview for Antebellum, the Janelle Monáe horror film, that also uses Juice. I guess they did a sneak preview of it during the MTV VMAs. And so in the sneak peek that they showed, Janelle Monáe's character gets abducted. They have like kind of, it's like a girls' night out, and the three friends like are sort of put into two different Uber cars. And Monet's character gets abducted while the other two characters, one of whom is played by Gabourey Sidibe and the other is a white woman, are like singing Juice out loud in their Uber car, while like Janelle Monáe is like being abducted to Warm Leatherette by The Normal. And so there's like this kind of editing that's going on between these two songs, being in a dialogue that suggests maybe a more insidious read on Juice, even than the one that Amber and I are, we're not really looking at insidiousness necessarily in our understandings of that song. But I was trying to sort of think through where I might see the erotic in the licensing, and it's not in any of those three songs. Tempo has been used in kind of an erotic register on Euphoria to sort of underscore cam girl culture. Boys has been used as sort of score music for sex scenes, and Love Looks Better in Color was licensed for the L Word Generation Q. So those are moments where we can sort of think about queer sexuality or sexuality at all, but it's not used, Juice is not used in that way in licensing. And I like that Amber is recentering the erotic, because I haven't been thinking about Juice at all in erotic terms through licensing.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think the three of us are going to have an interesting conversation about like how this unfolds. But I actually hadn't noticed, I mean, I do watch a lot of television, but I had not noted the trends in licensing that you pointed out in your paper around like, the tiredness around Lizzo. I think partially because a lot of my experience with Lizzo and sort of what I was trying to unpack was kind of like the types of insider knowledge that she's speaking to, even as like, I mean, I don't actually know the identity of the director of the video, but there was so much in it that I was just sort of like, only a POC person is going to be as invested in like lotion in this way. Or like, like all of these like sort of hints of kind of like something that could be underneath. So I found the song really interesting for kind of like its gestures toward forms of embodiment that would be known within a particular cultural milieu. But it's interesting to see how the song can also traffic in these like other ways that don't like, it can still have these related meanings without latching onto this kind of like underside, and I think the underside is like where we get like the erotics and like the possibilities. I mean, I think I'm really interested in like the specific calling of 80s feminism. And Shishi, this is where I'm going to sort of bring you explicitly into the conversation. But I think, I don't know if it's like, I think it's still an explicit sort of movement toward Audre Lorde and thinking about that. But what's also interesting about that moment of Black feminisms is its investment in pedagogy, right? And so sort of thinking about, and so I'm just sort of, and that is a very different type of feminism than say like the type of popular feminism, Alex, that you were talking about, right? So I'm sort of curious, Shishi, if you have something to say about kind of how pedagogy is maybe infused in this conversation too.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting because I've been following her for a long time. I was in Madison when she was getting started in Minneapolis, and so I've been following her since she was like opening for Harmar Superstar, and like, in those situations, she's able to speak like much more directly to like a group of like 100 people and be like, okay, let me like take you step by step through these things. And then like, yeah, it's been interesting to see like, especially like in the last 2 years, how it's been like this exponential curve that she's had to like kind of recenter herself and like adjust the message and be like, okay, what can I say to 1,000 people that'll still reach them? Like, okay, I can't like take 5 minutes and explain like, oh, I used to have bad self-esteem because these guys would say, oh, you have a pretty face, but you're fat. But like now I can take a moment after a song and say like, hey, all you mostly white teenagers, Black Lives Matter. Hey, you mostly white teenagers, like big is beautiful. Like, so she can like, yeah, she's had to like readjust, but like, I feel like the message is still there. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Amber.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right that the message, I think it's just interesting how layered they are, right? And so it's sort of like and in that way, I think we can sort of think about like the message, maybe the message that's translating is so much about multiculturalism and sort of like, okay, like here's the base level of how to engage with POC in this predominantly white audience. But then I think, there are these other messages of like, I mean, I don't know, like the Juice video to me also feels like a history lesson of sort of like, here's what Jerry Curl did to your hair. Here's what people did. Yes, like here are different types of embodiments that used to be centered within, these types of frameworks. And it's sort of, I find that like also just an interesting pedagogical tool in and of itself, right? Sort of like there's this other arc of Black femininity that.
I'd also add to that maybe too, thinking about the 80s, like one thing that I see when I see the Juice video is an obvious intertextual reference to Coming to America, like the Soul Glow commercial in the middle of it, and like the sort of, in the context of the movie, like how that's sort of funny in terms of what people are doing with their hair and Black cultural trends around hair care. But also thinking about how Coming to America and folks like Raquel Gates have talked about this quite beautifully about the sort of cult status of Coming to America for Black audiences specifically. So I think that might also be a gesture toward Black cultural expression and histories of Black cultural production that may otherwise get lost in some of these sort of mainstream diversity for white people modes of expression too.
We have a question, hand raised from Christine Capitola. I'm going to unmute her.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for such wonderful papers and presentations. Hello, people I know and have met before. Something I marked when I was watching them here this morning was how both Amber and Alex talked about Shine, and they both talked about it in relation to Juice in ways that seem to be doing different things, but we might be able to put into conversation together. So Alex, you were talking about it in terms of a reciprocity of people investing in long-term friendship and each person investing in the other person, growing into themselves. And Amber, you were speaking more of this relationship to the self, but then I'm also thinking about another part of Central Access, the chapter on deep listening, which is the one I go to the most as someone who does sound and vibration work, and the relationality that comes out of Jouissance and this different relationship to self. So maybe you two could talk somewhere together about that. And then Chi-Chi, if you have a gloss on Shine too, or a take on how this could be a kind of teaching in itself, that would be really interesting to hear about.
Well, I mean, one thing that I think of in addition to sort of how I'm talking about it in terms of how Shine has been, I guess, co-opted for a lack of a better word in terms of licensing decisions that I think kind of gets established with Broad City, since Broad City is the first show. They get like the sneak preview of Juice before it's actually released because of Lizzo's pre-existing relationship with the music supervisor and the licensing of Let 'Em Say for season 3, the duet that she did with Caroline Smith. So there's like that component of how Shine functions within storytelling about female friendships and in the context of Broad City, maybe even broadening the scope of friendship to include gender nonconforming people, non-white people, BIPOC, et cetera. But I also think about this in relation to Lizzo's own practices in terms of sort of building a network for herself, particularly as somebody who is now part of the major label apparatus. Like she's working, she's on Atlantic now, but I think she's always been very mindful of trying to keep the network that she came up with in the indie scene in Minneapolis close to her. Obviously, her friendship with Sophia Aries, her DJ, has been there from the beginning and has been an integral part of her. I'm not going to say squad, community, collective. Squad is kind of a weird word in this context. But also thinking about, there was a recent article in Billboard magazine of like her team, and her very much thinking of the people that work with her in terms of her management, in terms of her hair and makeup team, in terms of her social media, the people who run her social media accounts, that she's wanting to make sure that she centers queer people of color and having them be part of the network that creates Lizzo, the star text, and also creates opportunities for those queer creators of color to be part of the pop ecosystem. I also think about this, and I know that Christine, you have written about this in other contexts, like Janelle Monáe's relationship in Atlanta with like Wonderland and creating that sort of collective space for herself. We could also think of like Solange and Saint Heron and these sort of collectives that allow for us to sort of reposition Shine away from how I'm talking about it in terms of music licensing and like kind of commodifiable female friendships, and into how Shine can become sort of a way of thinking about networks of people of color working together toward creative cross purposes to create change.
That's a great, yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of, I think for me, what I found interesting about because I write, also in Sensual Excess, I write about Shine in relation to friction. And I thought what was so fascinating about what Lizzo was doing with Shine, both in the video aesthetics and in the deployment, was sort of like her on everybody working together. I think it becomes an interesting moment to return to art and think about sort of like the way that everybody sort of loves her, and she's like the Black feminist that everybody kind of cites, and it's like the erotic is everywhere and it belongs to me. And I sort of feel like there is a way that Shine, because it sort of facilitates this like these ideas of coming together, but sometimes coming together isn't necessarily about like an in-depth form of listening, right? Which is what I think lends itself to these sort of like Shine can be white lady empowerment, or Shine can be this like deeper sort of thing. And I think, I want to say that I think Lizzo does that, especially if we take into account, I think like a lot of her Instagram performances over quarantine with like leading people in group meditation, like that, produce like deep forms of connectivity around around sort of like an in-depth form of solidarity rather than kind of like the more superficial version. But I think Shine as a commodity is just like so complicated. I think it's hard to keep it from being uncommodified.
Gigi, do you have anything to add to the Shine talk, or?
Not especially. I think they've said a lot.
Well, but I guess sort of like adjacently related, I was wondering, and this is kind of related to a presentation that happened last week, and thinking about Lizzo in school settings pedagogically, specifically and explicitly in a kind of marching band framework or marching band world. And I'm thinking of Alex Reed's presentation last week on parade aesthetics. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you have to say about, because the other figures in your presentation were, are pretty cool hip hop like pedagogues, right?
Yeah.
And what in particular we get from the kind of band geek framing of Lizzo's school impact or pedagogical impact?
I think it's certainly interesting that like she kind of like as she was coming up, like, she was focused on like establishing herself as an MC to be taken seriously. And then, started incorporating more pop, like she started wearing outfits and had dancers. And then it was like, as she got those feet under her and was like starting to reach that next level, was like, you know what, I'm bringing back the flute. And like, then like she starts to make this like very concerted effort to be like, hey, band geeks, you could be cool like this, like, and then like she makes that very public return to the University of Houston, where like she goes there for homecoming and like, you know, does some like guest conducting, like works with the I'm gonna blank on the professor's name, but her band director that she had when she was there. And yeah, I think there is something to be said about the way that like she keeps finding ways to make herself more inclusive and like to bring people in to be like, yeah, like you didn't think that like playing flute would be a way to pop stardom, but I'm going to show you the pathway.
Yeah, so it is like a kind of an alternate pedagogy, right? Yeah, another pathway. Alex, you
I also think sort of related to that, and this is where I admit that Chi-Chi and I are roommates, and he helped me discover Lizzo. But I remember going to early shows in Lizzo's career in Madison. She played Madison when we were living there, where I was getting my PhD, like twice, sometimes 3 times a year, and was very much sort of part of the fabric of like college radio, and a lot of her audience was mainly like the college students or you know, kind of college age students living in Wisconsin at the time. Many of them were actually students of mine. And again, thinking about like sort of the fraught politics of creating an audience that is seeking to be multicultural, but in many ways, because of gentrification, allocation of resources, it is a predominantly white audience she's speaking to, particularly at the college age level. I think so much of like how Lizzo sort of treated these kinds of festival spaces or these small venues in college towns as like teachable moments, and also like the importance of the merch booth. Like I often think about her kind of in relation to Elizabeth Warren in that early time where she would like get out the vote. She would talk to every single like college aged, you know, women's studies white girl or, you know, in some instances non-white girl, but often it was white girls, and many of them I taught. And really sort of like having that kind of one-to-one connection with those audience members, and trying to sort of help them think or reconsider issues related to fat acceptance, self-care, these kinds of things, like on stage, but also at the merch booth, having those kind of one-on-one mentorship moments too.
Yeah, I'll just add, having seen her at the Majestic Theater in Madison, which has a capacity of about 750, and she did stay there until the last person left the venue. Like if anyone wanted to talk to her about the songs, get a picture, like she made sure to stay through the entire line. So I think your Elizabeth Warren comparison is on point.
But it also, I mean, and again, I'm thinking about this as a college professor, like that is what you do after lecture, right? When the kid comes up to you and is like, oh, hey, I really wanted to talk to you about this one thing that you mentioned in passing in class. And then you have like a whole 30-minute conversation while you're trying to sort of get out of the classroom. But you want to like kind of latch onto that moment and you know, help that kid grow. That feels very professorial to me.
Yeah, and that was something that I came across time and time again as I was talking to these professors who also work in hip hop, was they all said like, oh yeah, like the conversation starts on stage and then we get into it at the merch booth. And I kind of like, it kind of feels like going to office hours.
Yeah. So we have about 6 minutes left, and you know, we're open to questions. We've already had a question fielded from the crowd. There's a comment in the chat about Lizzo's creative director who directed the Juice video as well. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see that, Amber, in relation to your piece from Stephen Shaviro. I was glancing at it a little bit. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, knowing or having that information. But also, yeah, give me a moment to like scan for hands, or if anybody has any comments or questions that they want to add in response to what you've been hearing in the conversation now, as well as the videos.
I know I'm like not technologically savvy enough to I can't do more than just the Zoom at once. But, no, but that was, it does make me feel better knowing that the video is directed by a person of color, right? It feels like I'm right about what I'm saying about it, but I do think it makes the question of the licensing really complicated, right? Because if it's this model of sort of like, Lizzo's has this platform has this depth and like, and one-on-one engagement, like that can emerge. And then the question is sort of like, well, then what happens when those roots are severed and it sort of like lands in all of these other areas, right? Where like, she can't be doing the after show talk, right? Yeah, which I mean, I don't think there's a solution to that because licensing happens. And
that might be where Instagram comes in too. Or thinking about, I remember a couple days ago, Chi and I, and sort of anticipating this conversation, we're talking about the Fuck It Up to the Tempo dance videos that Lizzo encouraged her followers to sort of record their own versions of dancing to the song. Maybe this is a way to get into your comments about WAP, which I do want to talk about, Amber, because I don't really think there's a connection that we need to suss out what's going on there with Lizzo and Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B. But that dance craze moment allows Lizzo to make her audience, particularly the fat people of color in her audience, legible through the delight of dancing and through like the sort of physicality and spectacularity of their bodies. I think that is a moment where she can maybe use social media to remediate the merch booth and take the spotlight off of her and back onto her audience.
Yeah, I like that idea. Because I think one of the things that we're getting at, right, is how, music in general, but especially the way we're talking about Lizzo, it's so much more about than just the song. It is like the way the song makes you move and like move through the world and think through the world, which I do feel like is also part of the sort of like Black feminist legacy, which, we can talk about WAP if you it's like my goal to talk about WAP in like every public Zoom I do.
Yeah. Let's go there. We have. I know that this is also going to be such a. We only have 3 minutes to do it, but let's start the conversation.
WAP is all about shine, so it's like there's just this continuity. You can't have that kind of lubrication without glistening. I don't know that I have deeper things to say about the connection than that. But.
We have time for one more comment or question as we wrap up this really fun and illuminating session. We could also let the last comment about WAP and shine and lubrication stand as the last comment from the Lizzo's Exuberance panel.
One thing that I'll note, I don't want to have the last word, especially as a white woman, but one thing that I think will be very interesting to see about her relationship to commercial storytelling is her Amazon deal. I don't know if people have seen that Lizzo has signed a first look deal with Amazon for a series of television projects. And this was last month. In the Variety article I read, there wasn't any, and maybe people in the room who have intel may know, but there hasn't been any sort of details of what that will entail. But I do think it's very canny of her to realize that like the money may be in licensing and the money may be in her figuring out how to make herself televisual. And so I'm sort of curious, I hope that things don't get lost in that process, but I am sort of interested in what she's going to do with a development deal at Amazon to create TV content.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. And honestly, the ways in which she's already, been marketed and licensed and distributed pre-TV may come into more relevance now in a like non-live production or limited live production world, post-COVID. So it'll be interesting to see how she's going to draw upon those different her different successes and different abilities on these other platforms to do that. 1 minute. Eric Weisbart has a bridge question.
It's just a thought as we slide over. When I first saw Lizzo, it was at a Turning the Tables event at Lincoln Center, where she was doing girl group music as part of that sort of celebration. And I was wondering about Lizzo's relationship to older music and how that sort of is an aspect of her work persona moment in time?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this that are all kind of disparate, but I mean, you know, I think it's very savvy of her in terms of how she framed herself during her Grammy performance a million years ago last February, when she's like sort of the leader of this big band that, correct me if I'm wrong, was it an all-female band? I mean, she typically plays with a predominantly female or entirely female group of instrumentalists and dancers, so I think it was a female band. But she's like sort of hearkening back to the era of Billie Holiday and Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald. And like, obviously on this record, like when I hear "Cause I Love You," I can't not hear Little Richard, especially on that, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Like that's as old as rock music itself. Yeah, and so I definitely, and also thinking about that SNL performance that she did last Christmas where her guitar player was like deliberately styled to look like Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Mm-hmm. I definitely think she has a real awareness of Black women's historical contributions to popular music and her relationship to that history. I'd be curious to hear other people's thoughts on that, but I think it's there for sure.
I would also throw into the mix, in terms of her roots, it's always interesting because, like, you know, like as she's come up, like she's kind of had to like compartmentalize stuff until she reached a certain level. But when she was first coming up in Minneapolis, like I mentioned before, first time I saw her, she was opening for Harmar Superstar. But then after she played her set, she then joined Harmar's band and sang backup and kind of played that role. So at one point she was kind of not exactly in a girl group, but like playing a more throwback soul role in that capacity.
Well, on that note, now we're a couple minutes behind, but it was a bridge question into the next panel. So please wave your hands at our first panel of the day. And thank you all for that wonderful conversation.